October 15th, 1912. Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. In the gilded halls of New York's most prestigious mansion, a woman sat perfectly still at her mahogany writing desk, methodically tearing pages from her own diary, not in anger, but with the calculated precision of someone erasing their own existence. Victoria Ashworth, wife to railroad magnate Charles Ashworth, had spent the last 3 hours destroying 17 years of her innermost thoughts, keeping only the entries that revealed what she had discovered about the man sleeping in the bed beside her each night. Before we dive deeper into this psychological labyrinth, tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there as you hear these words? What drives a mind to systematically dismantle its own history while simultaneously documenting evidence of someone else's calculated evil? This question would haunt investigators for over a century. The first clue to Victoria's psychological unraveling lay not in what she destroyed, but in what she chose to preserve. Detective Thomas Morrison would later find 43 diary entries, each dated exactly 7 days apart, each containing a single sentence written in increasingly erratic handwriting. He watches me when he thinks I'm sleeping. But this was only the surface of something much darker, a methodical campaign of psychological warfare that had been escalating for months. The Ashworth mansion stood as a monument to American industrial success, its 40 rooms housing not just a family, but the carefully constructed facade of a marriage that had become a prison of the mind. Victoria Pemberton had entered this gilded cage 17 years earlier, a vibrant 22-year-old from declining old money aristocracy, seeking security through union with a man whose fortune was matched only by his hunger for social acceptance. Charles Ashworth, 23 years her senior, possessed the kind of calculated charm that masked something fundamentally broken in his psychological architecture. If you find yourself questioning the nature of human evil as this story unfolds, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments, because the darkest aspects of this case will challenge everything you believe about the capacity for manipulation within the human mind. The psychological game between Victoria and Charles had begun innocuously enough in the spring of 1912. Victoria had started noticing small discrepancies. Objects moved slightly from their original positions, conversations Charles claimed never happened, letters he insisted she had written but had no memory of composing. Initially, she attributed these inconsistencies to the natural forgetfulness that comes with managing a household of 20 servants and maintaining the social obligations of New York's elite. But Victoria Ashworth possessed a mind too sharp and methodical to be easily gaslit. Born into a family where intellectual discourse was valued above emotional expression, she had been raised to trust logic over instinct, evidence over assumption. This rational foundation would become both her greatest asset and her ultimate vulnerability in the psychological chess match that was about to unfold. The first documented sign of Victoria's mental deterioration appeared in her correspondence with her sister Catherine, who lived in Boston. In a letter dated May 3, 1912, Victoria wrote, "Something peculiar is happening to my mind, Catherine. I find myself doubting memories I was certain of just days ago. Charles says I am becoming forgetful, but I have always prided myself on my memory. Yesterday, I discovered a book in my study that I have no recollection of purchasing, yet it bears my signature inside the cover. The handwriting appears to be mine, but I swear upon our mother's grave that I did not write those words." Charles Ashworth's psychological manipulation followed a pattern so subtle that even seasoned investigators initially missed its calculated precision. He would plant evidence of Victoria's supposed mental instability while simultaneously positioning himself as her concerned, loving husband. Servants would later testify to finding Victoria's personal items in impossible locations, her jewelry in the kitchen pantry, her reading glasses buried in the garden soil, her favorite fountain pen inside the piano bench, always in places she never visited. The brilliance of Charles's gaslighting campaign lay in its progressive escalation. Each incident was plausible enough to be explained away, yet collectively, they formed a narrative of a woman losing her grip on reality. Victoria's diary entries from June 1912 reveal her growing paranoia. "I have begun marking the positions of objects in my study with tiny pencil marks. 3 times this week, items have been moved precisely 2 inches to the left. When I mention this to Charles, he looks at me with such genuine concern that I almost believe I'm imagining things." But Victoria's academic background in psychology, she had studied at Radcliffe College before her marriage, provided her with an unexpected advantage. She began documenting the pattern of her supposed forgetfulness, creating detailed charts and timelines that revealed the systematic nature of the psychological assault being waged against her. Her diary entry from July 15, 1912, demonstrates this methodical approach. "The incidents occur every Tuesday and Friday, always between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., when Charles claims to be at his office, but the servants report seeing him in the house. I have tested this by deliberately placing objects in specific positions and checking them after his supposed visits to town." The psychological complexity of their relationship deepened when Victoria discovered Charles's private study contained detailed notes about her daily routines, her emotional responses to stress, and her psychological vulnerabilities. These notes, written in Charles's distinctive handwriting, revealed a level of premeditation that transformed their marriage from a domestic dispute into something far more sinister. Victoria's mental state began to fragment as she realized the scope of her husband's manipulation. Her handwriting became erratic, her sleep patterns disrupted, and her social interactions strained as she struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy while gathering evidence of Charles's psychological campaign. The servants noticed her talking to herself, but what they interpreted as madness was actually Victoria's attempt to create an audio record of her experiences, speaking her observations aloud to ensure she wouldn't forget them. The question that haunted Victoria and would later consume investigators was not simply what Charles wanted to accomplish, but why he had chosen such an elaborate method of psychological torture. The answer lay buried in the financial records of the Ashworth Empire, records that would reveal Charles's desperate need to have Victoria declared mentally incompetent before she could discover the true extent of his criminal activities. As the autumn approached in 1912, Victoria's investigation into her husband's business dealings had uncovered irregularities that went far beyond financial impropriety. She had documented patterns of suspicious deaths among Charles's business rivals, accidents that had eliminated obstacles to his expansion while appearing entirely coincidental. But Charles had been monitoring Victoria's investigation, and he knew that her rational, methodical mind posed an existential threat to everything he had built. The psychological warfare between Victoria and Charles entered a new phase in August 1912, when Victoria discovered something that would shatter her understanding of her husband's true nature. Hidden behind a false panel in Charles's private study, a panel she found only because she had been systematically searching every inch of their mansion for evidence of his manipulation, were detailed psychological profiles of 7 women, all written in Charles's meticulous handwriting. Each profile contained intimate details about the women's fears, vulnerabilities, and mental breaking points. The names were familiar to Victoria. These were the wives of Charles's deceased business rivals, women who had all suffered mysterious nervous breakdowns following their husbands' untimely deaths. The profiles read like instruction manuals for psychological destruction, complete with timelines showing how long each woman had taken to succumb to what appeared to be natural mental deterioration. But it was the 8th profile that caused Victoria's hands to tremble as she read it. Written across the top in Charles's distinctive script was her own name, followed by a detailed analysis of her personality that was so accurate, so intimately invasive, that she realized Charles had been studying her like a specimen since the day they met. The document revealed that their entire 17-year marriage had been an elaborate psychological experiment, with Victoria as the unwitting subject. The profile contained disturbing insights into Victoria's psyche. Subject exhibits strong need for intellectual validation and fears above all else the loss of mental acuity. Responds to subtle environmental manipulation with increased documentation behavior, which can be exploited to create appearance of obsessive-compulsive deterioration. Religious upbringing creates vulnerability to moral guilt, useful for inducing self-doubt about own perceptions. Charles had been implementing a systematic plan to drive Victoria insane, but not randomly. He was following a precise methodology he had perfected on 7 other women. The realization that she was not his first victim transformed Victoria's fear into something far more dangerous. Calculated determination to expose the truth. Victoria's diary entries from late August 1912 reveal the moment her psychological defense mechanisms shifted from survival to counterattack. I understand now that Charles is not merely gaslighting me. He is following a proven formula for psychological destruction that he has used to eliminate threats before. But he has made one crucial error. He has underestimated the very trait he identified as my greatest strength. My need for intellectual validation means I will document everything, and documentation creates evidence. Mayu. The evidence Victoria began gathering painted a chilling picture of Charles's true nature. She discovered that his first wife, Eleanor, had died in a private asylum in 1894, officially from complications related to feminine hysteria, but actually from what medical records described as complete mental collapse following months of inexplicable paranoid episodes. Eleanor's family had never questioned the diagnosis, accepting Charles's explanation that his young wife had been overcome by the pressures of high society life. Victoria's investigation revealed a pattern that extended beyond the wives of Charles's business rivals. She found newspaper clippings documenting the fates of 3 former household servants who had worked for the Ashworth family, all of whom had suffered mysterious mental breakdowns after being dismissed from service. Each had been committed to psychiatric institutions after exhibiting symptoms identical to what Victoria was now experiencing. Claims that objects were being moved, insistence that conversations had occurred differently than witnesses remembered, and desperate attempts to document evidence of manipulation that others dismissed as delusions. The psychological complexity of Charles's methodology became clear as Victoria decoded his system. He would begin by establishing himself as a trustworthy figure in his victim's life, someone who showed concern for their well-being. Then, he would introduce subtle environmental inconsistencies while simultaneously creating witnesses who would corroborate his version of events. The victim would begin to doubt their own perception, leading to increased anxiety and erratic behavior that supported Charles's narrative of mental instability. But Charles's most insidious technique involved exploiting his victim's attempts to gather evidence against him. He would plant false evidence that seemed to support their suspicions, encouraging them to build elaborate theories about his manipulation, only to later reveal that the evidence was fake, making their accusations appear to be products of paranoid delusion. This cycle of hope and betrayal was designed to destroy their credibility while simultaneously undermining their faith in their own judgment. Victoria realized that Charles had been using this exact technique on her. The diary entries she had found in her own handwriting, the books with her signature that she didn't remember purchasing, the letters she supposedly wrote but had no memory of composing. These were all part of Charles's psychological trap. He had been forging her handwriting for months, creating a false record of mental deterioration that he could present to physicians as evidence of her declining sanity. The financial records Victoria discovered revealed Charles's ultimate motive. The Ashworth fortune was built on a foundation of calculated murder disguised as business competition. When rivals threatened his expansion, Charles would systematically destroy their wives' mental health, knowing that the resulting family crises would distract and weaken his opponents. The men would become vulnerable to manipulation or outright elimination while dealing with their wives' apparent madness. But Victoria's case was different. Charles needed her declared mentally incompetent not to eliminate a business rival, but to prevent her from exposing his entire criminal enterprise. Victoria had been getting too close to uncovering the truth about the mysterious deaths of his competitors, and her systematic academic approach to investigation posed a direct threat to his carefully constructed reputation. The psychological toll of these discoveries was evident in Victoria's increasingly frantic diary entries. Her handwriting became more erratic as she struggled to process the magnitude of Charles's deception, but her documentation remained methodical and precise. She had realized that her sanity, and potentially her life, depended on creating an unshakable record of evidence that could not be dismissed as delusion. Victoria's final diary entries from September 1912 reveal the depth of her psychological transformation. The frightened, confused woman who had first noticed objects moving in her study had evolved into something far more dangerous to Charles. A woman who understood exactly what he was and was preparing to fight back with his own methods. She had begun her own campaign of psychological warfare against Charles, subtly altering his environment in ways that would create doubt about his own perceptions. But Victoria's approach differed from her husband's in one crucial way. She was documenting everything not to cover her tracks, but to create an evidence trail that would survive, even if she did not. The question that would haunt investigators for generations was whether Victoria's counter-manipulation strategy had triggered Charles to accelerate his timeline for her elimination, or whether her psychological fightback had actually been part of his plan all along, a final test to confirm her mental instability before implementing the ultimate solution to the threat she represented. October 1st, 1912. Victoria Ashworth made a discovery that would transform her from hunted prey into something Charles had never encountered before. A victim who understood his methodology well enough to turn it against him. While searching through financial records in Charles's locked filing cabinet, a lock she had learned to pick during her weeks of covert investigation, Victoria found correspondence that revealed the true scope of his psychological empire. The letters exchanged between Charles and a network of physicians, lawyers, and private asylum operators documented a systematic business model built on the strategic elimination of inconvenient individuals through induced mental collapse. Charles wasn't just a serial killer. He was the architect of an entire industry designed to remove threats to powerful men's interests by destroying their targets' credibility and sanity before eliminating them entirely. Dr. Heinrich Brenner, director of Hillcrest Private Sanitarium, had written to Charles, "The Pemberton woman has been successfully committed following the documentation you provided of her declining mental state. Her family's attempts to contest the commitment have been dismissed by the court based on the evidence of her increasingly erratic behavior. Payment of $15,000 has been received as agreed. We anticipate her natural death within 6 months due to her refusal to eat, which we will attribute to melancholia." Victoria recognized the name immediately. Margaret Pemberton had been her childhood friend, a brilliant woman who had threatened to expose corruption in the City Planning Commission. Margaret had died in Hillcrest Sanitarium in 1910, and Victoria had attended her funeral, never suspecting that her own husband had orchestrated her friend's destruction. The correspondence revealed that Charles's network extended far beyond New York. Similar arrangements existed in Boston Philadelphia, and Chicago, creating a web of corruption that allowed wealthy men to eliminate threats by having their targets declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized. The psychological torture was merely the preliminary phase. The real goal was always elimination disguised as natural death from mental illness. But Victoria's most chilling discovery was a letter dated September 28, 1912, just 3 days earlier. Dr. Brenner had written, "The preparations for Mrs. Ashworth's admission have been completed. Based on the documentation you have provided of her paranoid delusions and obsessive record-keeping behavior, the commitment papers have been pre-approved by Judge Morrison. We await only your signal to proceed with the intervention." Victoria realized that Charles had been preparing for her elimination for months. Every piece of evidence she had gathered, every attempt to document his manipulation, had been anticipated and incorporated into his plan. Her rational response to his gaslighting had been used to build the very case that would destroy her credibility and ultimately her life. The psychological horror of this revelation was that Victoria's greatest strength, her methodical, academic approach to uncovering the truth, had been weaponized against her. Charles had allowed her to discover just enough evidence to make her appear paranoid to outside observers, while ensuring that the most damning evidence remained hidden where only she could find it, making her claims seem like elaborate delusions. Victoria's final diary entry, dated October 14, 1912, the day before her murder, reveals the moment she realized the true genius of Charles's psychological trap. "I understand now that Charles has been orchestrating my investigation from the beginning. He wanted me to find evidence of his crimes because my discovery of that evidence, combined with my inability to prove it to others, would be used to demonstrate my mental instability. Every move I have made to expose him has been part of his plan to destroy me." But Victoria had made one discovery that Charles hadn't anticipated. Hidden among the correspondence was a letter from an investigative journalist named Thomas Hartwell, who had been independently researching the suspicious deaths of business leaders' wives across the northeastern United States. Hartwell had identified a pattern connecting the deaths to Charles's business dealings and was preparing to publish an expose that would destroy Charles's entire network. Victoria realized that Charles's timeline for her elimination had been accelerated, not because of her investigation, but because Hartwell's expose was scheduled for publication in November 1912. Charles needed Victoria declared insane and institutionalized before the article appeared, ensuring that any claims she might make about his involvement in the crimes would be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. The psychological complexity of Victoria's final weeks was revealed in her last letters to her sister Catherine. She had begun implementing a desperate strategy. If Charles was going to use her rational documentation against her, she would create evidence so methodical and comprehensive that it could not be dismissed as delusion, even after her death. Victoria had been secretly copying Charles's correspondence and hiding the copies in locations throughout Manhattan. Safe deposit boxes registered under false names, sealed envelopes left with trusted family lawyers, and detailed records hidden in public, locations where they would eventually be discovered. She had transformed herself from victim into investigator, creating a posthumous case that would expose Charles's crimes even if she did not survive to present it herself. But Charles had been monitoring Victoria's activities more closely than she realized. On the evening of October 15, 1912, he discovered that she had been copying his correspondence. The realization that Victoria had outmaneuvered his psychological manipulation and created evidence that could survive her elimination triggered the catastrophic escalation that would end in her brutal murder. The physical evidence from the crime scene revealed the psychological state of both victim and killer in those final moments. Victoria had been murdered while sitting at her writing desk, her hand still holding a pen, suggesting that she had been documenting something until the moment of her death. The papers on her desk had been destroyed, but forensic analysis would later reveal impressions on the underlying wood that spelled out a single word: Hartwell. Charles had killed Victoria not in a rage, but as a calculated business decision. The psychological torture, the gaslighting, the systematic destruction of her credibility, all of it had been designed to make her murder appear to be the inevitable result of her mental deterioration. But Victoria's counter-investigation had created evidence that would ultimately destroy him, even from beyond the grave. The question that haunted investigators for decades was whether Victoria had deliberately provoked Charles into killing her, knowing that her murder would trigger the discovery of evidence that would expose his entire criminal network. Had she transformed herself from victim into martyr, using her own death as the final piece of evidence in a case that would bring down a killer who had evaded justice for years? Thomas Hartwell's exposé was published 3 weeks after Victoria's murder, revealing the full scope of Charles's psychological empire. The article, titled "The Mind Killers: How America's Elite Eliminate Inconvenient Women," connected Victoria's death to a network of similar murders across the country. Within 6 months, Charles Ashworth and 12 co-conspirators had been arrested, tried, and convicted of multiple counts of murder. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case was not Charles's ability to systematically destroy human minds, but the realization that Victoria Ashworth had ultimately defeated him using the very weapon he had wielded against so many others: the calculated manipulation of human psychology. She had turned his own methodology against him, creating a psychological trap that used her own death as bait. Do you think anyone is truly immune to the kind of systematic psychological manipulation that Charles Ashworth perfected? As you consider the fragility of human perception and the ease with which reality can be distorted, remember that the line between sanity and madness may be far thinner than any of us want to believe. The human mind's capacity for both creation and destruction remains one of our species' most terrifying mysteries. Victoria Ashworth's story reminds us that evil often wears the face of respectability, and that sometimes the only way to defeat a monster is to understand the darkness well enough to use it as a weapon. If this exploration into the depths of human psychology has affected you as deeply as it affected me in researching it, I encourage you to share your thoughts with others who might need to hear this story. Subscribe to continue exploring the darkest corners of the human experience. And remember that understanding evil is often the first step in recognizing it when it appears in our own lives.